Good evening. We begin tonight keeping them honest with Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price and his apparent love of pricey private planes. New developments tonight about just how much all those plane trips cost the federal government, meaning how much they cost American taxpayers. After extensive reporting on Price's trips and apparently anger from the president, today a spokesperson said Price would reimburse the U.S. Treasury for the cost of his travel. But it turns out he isn't really doing that at all. He plans to only reimburse taxpayers for the cost of a seat on many of the private planes he took. Not the cost of fuel or the plane or the crew, just the cost of a seat. His spokesperson said he would reimburse about $52,000. Well, now we're learning that the full cost of chartering the planes was far higher than previously reported. According to a new report in Politico, which broke this story, Price's trips just since May have cost the American taxpayers more than $1 million. Just earlier today, the White House tried to downplay its role.
But to be clear, also, the White House does not have a role on the front end of approving private chartered flights at the agencies, and that's something that we're certainly looking into from this point forward, and have asked a halt be put, particularly at HHS, on any private chartered flights moving forward until those reviews are completed.
Well, keeping them honest, the White House may not approve private planes for the Health and Human Services Department, but it did play a role in Price's exorbitant travel costs overall. Tonight, Politico reports the White House approved the use of military aircraft for Price's trips to Africa, Europe, and Asia to the tune of more than $500,000, which added to the private plane costs, pushing it over $1 million. Again, Price has vowed to reimburse the government about $52,000. The HHS Inspector General is investigating the whole mess, but in the case of the private jets, anyone who knows how to use Orbitz or Priceline.com can figure out pretty quickly how outrageous Price's travel costs were. It's about $300 to fly commercial from Washington to Nashville. Price took a private plane at a price tag of more than $17,000. At least 24 trips since May, according to Politico. They found 5 private flights in 1 week, including one from Washington to Philadelphia. You can drive in about 2.5 hours or take a train for about $72. And let's not forget, this is just the kind of spending that Price railed against under the Obama administration, in particular, spending for private planes for members of Congress. Here's what he said about then Speaker Nancy Pelosi in 2010.
Well, I want to say to the Speaker, don't you fly over our country in your luxury jet and lecture us on what it means to be an American.
The magic of videotape. Tom Price was still talking about being frugal as recently as this summer. Politico reports at a conference in San Diego in June, Price said it's incredibly important to get rid of wasteful spending.
Who is talking to us confidentially, who says the president actually is incensed by this, and the fact that it's $52,000 to pay for that when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is not going to help Secretary Price keep his job. But we did catch up with the secretary a short time ago here in Washington. We asked him about where he stands. Let's take a listen.
Mr. Secretary, a couple of quick questions. Will the check that you're writing, will that satisfy your bosses and the taxpayers' questions?
I think what we've done right now is to demonstrate good faith effort that we've heard the concern and the criticism, and we look forward to the Inspector General's report.
Do you plan to stay on the job?
Absolutely.
Well, he said there he absolutely would stay on the job. But Anderson, of course, that is not a decision that's up to him. That's a decision that's up to the president. And that interview was done just shortly before this latest revelation out in Politico again tonight about $500,000 more worth of foreign travel on military aircraft. And again, it's not the travel necessarily that's the question here. Cabinet secretaries, as we know, travel all over the place. He was in Ebola, or he was looking into the treatment of Ebola in Africa. He was attending World Health Organizations. What's different about this, Anderson, is that he is using either private planes or military planes. Every recent Health and Human Services Secretary we've talked to a lot of them, Republicans and Democrats, they say, look, we always flew commercial. The difference here is usually these military planes, they're reserved for the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, others who have urgent business that's in the matters of national security, not the Health and Human Services Secretary.
Well, also, I mean, they just frankly haven't I mean, his office just hasn't been upfront about the reasons behind this or the number of trips. I mean, at one point they were saying, well, look, he's just so busy. Sometimes you just got to take private planes. One of these trips was to this, to this island, I guess, and where they have a house with his wife, and there was some sort of a conference there. But they went St. Simon's. They went there like 2 days early. So the idea that, there was no commercial flight, there was no way to get there commercially, I mean, that's just bunk.
It is not held up, and the reality here is, Anderson, we've seen a lot of these situations in Washington before where you think someone may hold on, and this will be the president's decision. We will see about this, but they have not essentially followed, crisis management 101 by getting everything out there. Now you're wondering, this latest revelation tonight, are they trying to get everything out there? But boy, all these new revelations, again, are not giving the president confidence in his secretary. Again, talking to someone close to this White House and the president, saying that this has made it even more difficult for the president to stick with him. We'll see if he will or not. But it also is opening questions for people throughout the government, other cabinet secretaries, others. Who else is doing this? Of course, there are many wealthy members of this cabinet who fly on their own planes, and that is fine. Other ones who are, moderately wealthy. I think Secretary Price has a net worth of, plus $10 million or so. Not enough to get a private plane. Was he wanting to sort of live that lifestyle as well? We'll see. But Anderson, no question, tomorrow the president will be asked again about this, if he'll keep him on board. Again, it's up to him, but he's in hot water tonight.
Yeah, I think, by the way, I think $10 million net worth is more than moderately wealthy. It seems pretty...
No doubt, but probably not enough to buy a private jet.
Probably
and
so.
Situation. I wouldn't know. I don't know.
Yeah, Jeff Zeleny, appreciate that. Joining us now is CNN Chief Legal Analyst Jeffrey Toobin, also CNN Political Analyst and New York Times White House Correspondent Maggie Haberman. Jeff, I mean, what is going on with Secretary Price? I mean, this was a guy who was sort of ethical. There were ethical questions about him when he was in Congress. The idea that he wouldn't want every I to be dotted and every T to be crossed is unbelievable.
Well, the fact that he got confirmed at all when he was trading stock in companies that his committee was regulating in Congress is pretty astonishing in the first place. But also, I mean, the budget of the United States is about $1 trillion. This is only $1 million. If there is one thing that people are going to remember about Tom Price, it's the fact that he loved these private planes. I mean, it is vastly more significant, and this is something Donald Trump understands very well. Is one thing Donald Trump understands, it's public perception of stuff on television. And I don't see how he survives this, because it reinforces every bad stereotype about the Trump administration. Rich people, privileged people, rules don't apply to them.
Right. If the idea is draining the swamp, I mean, this is flying over the swamp in a private plane.
This is continuing the swamp in a private plane. Look, I mean, I agree with everything Jeff said, particularly the fact that the president has become aware in recent days of just how damaging this is for him, and that is what he cares about. What this impacts the public perception of him and his administration. At the beginning of the week, people were telling me in the White House they thought Price was going to survive this, that he was going to be pretty badly damaged, but he was already badly damaged. The president is not enamored of Tom Price. In all of his cabinet picks, that's not his favorite. The story in Politico, I think it was yesterday, or 2 days ago, about him taking the plane and visiting his son.
In Nashville.
There were a ton of instances in that story about him mingling his personal life with the use of his jets, and that was what put it overboard for the president. The president began musing about the idea that Price should have to pay this back, but he was told by people in his own circle, look, that raises questions about what that will mean for other people in terms of these flights. What does that mean for other cabinet secretaries? What does that mean for staff who went on these planes? As far as I know, and I know this from 2 administration officials, it's not clear how many people were actually aware Price was going to announce that he was reimbursing for that seat. There might have been a couple of people in the West Wing who knew. Most did not. The president, as I understand it, did not actually ask him to do this. So this continues to roll along as this chaos unchecked, and that just can't go on forever.
It just seems like a moronic announcement to make that you're just going to do this partial thing. I mean, I get it. He doesn't want to spend all that money, but...
It's moronic on 2 levels.
It just continues it.
Well, A, it continues it, number one. B, it raises a whole host of legal questions about, do other people then have to pay for their seats? How is this going to work? If you're doing it, what does that set in terms of the precedent? And it doesn't go away. It is all about, well, it's not only about It is partly about perception. And this president came in saying that he was going to be different. He was going to drain the swamp. This week, we have seen him back an establishment candidate for Senate who lost. We have seen his administration mired in all sorts of investigations. And now you have a cabinet, an appearance of a cabinet run amok. That just can't continue forever.
This is after the Treasury Secretary and his wife,
That's right.
flew that plane to Fort Knox.
The day of the eclipse.
It just happened to be the eclipse, and just, she decided to tweet on Instagram.
And remember, Tom Price was brought on because he was a member of Congress, and Congress was going to overturn Obamacare. That, of course, has turned into a major fiasco. It was the Senate, not the House, where Price came from, but still, there is nothing Donald Trump likes at the moment about House and Senate Republicans. Tom Price is a representative of them. It's another reason he's irritated.
There's also CNN reporting tonight that the administration is basically on the hunt for leakers within the Department of Health and Human Services. I mean, what's interesting about that is as if leaking is the egregious part of this whole tale.
That
Ask
always.
Maggie. She's the one who gets all the
That always tends to be where this goes with this administration. It is part. Recognition that there's a public issue here, and a very large part about paranoia and a fear that things are going on that we're not in control of. The bigger question for the White House right now is what is happening at various agencies. And there is a clear sense, when you put it all together, there have been questions about Scott Pruitt's spending at the EPA. His advisors have defended it pretty mightily, but, this soundproof booth that he was putting in.
He's got security, which most heads of the EPA do not.
That's
soundproof.
Right. So $25,000 soundproof booth has becomes sort of a giant bag of what is going on here.
It's also interesting because, I think one of the very effective parts of then candidate Trump's campaign was this notion of draining the swamp. I remember when the first time he said it, Corey Lewandowski was on the program saying, I think you're going to be hearing that phrase a lot. I think that's a really winning phrase.
He was right.
I just want to play all the times the president talked about that.
When it comes to Washington, D.C., it is time to drain the damn swamp. Drain the swamp. We're going to drain the swamp of Washington. We're going to have fun doing it. When we win on November 8th, we are going to drain the swamp. We are going to drain the swamp of government corruption in Washington, D.C. It is time to drain the swamp.
And now,
I think he wanted to drain the swamp. That's what I drew from what he was saying. But look who is in the government. I mean, it's a bunch of very wealthy people, very privileged people. Fortunately, some of them, like Betsy DeVos and Wilbur Ross, can afford their own private planes and are paying for their own private planes. But it is a very elite, wealthy group that is running the government. And apparently, Tom Price wants to live like them, even if he can't afford it.
Yeah. Maggie Haberman, thanks.
Approving private chartered flights at the agencies, and that's something that we're certainly looking into from this point forward, and have asked a halt be put, particularly at HHS, on any private chartered flights moving forward until those reviews are complete.
Not the cost of fuel or the plane or the crew, just the cost of a seat. His spokesperson said he would reimburse about $52,000. Well, now we're learning that the full cost of chartering the planes was far higher than previously reported. According to a new report in Politico reporting on Price's trips and apparently anger from the president, today a spokesperson said Price would reimburse the U.S. Treasury for the cost of his travel. But it turns out he isn't really doing that at all. He plans to only reimburse taxpayers for the cost of a seat on many of the private planes he took. Good evening. We begin tonight keeping him honest with Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price and his apparent love of pricey private planes. New developments tonight about just how much all those plane trips cost the federal government, meaning how much they cost American taxpayers. After extensive review, which broke this story, Price's trips just since May have cost the American taxpayers more than $1 million. Just earlier today, the White House tried to downplay its role.
But to be clear, also, the White House does not have a role on the front end of